Okay. So this section we're going to go into next is called personality psychology. It is a very complex area of psychology to study because we're not perfect with it. So we have a lot of theories right now to try and explain how we develop this sense of individual way of being that is kind of different than the person next to us. Some have called this study of personality, it's a study of individual differences. What makes individuals different, even in situations where we may be behaving the same. Okay. So to provide a little bit clearer definition, this bold one is what we will mainly be focusing on, but I want to give some background to the term personality. But the way we're defining personality for our class is the characteristic thoughts, and you can include things like beliefs and ideas with thoughts, emotional responses, whether we are quickly emotionally respond, slowly, if we have strong emotional responses or mild emotional responses, and behaviors, the way we interact with other people and the way we are. Now, this is the important part in personality, is that these tend to be relatively stable traits, relatively stable way of being in an individual over time and across circumstances. And well, we'll get to this relatively stable over time, but it's really who you are across time and situation that can be differentiated from other people in the space. Okay. Now, the word personality actually originates from the term persona. Persona is a Roman word that refers to a theatrical mask that Roman actors wore playing Greek dramas. Okay. Uh, and what this basically then translates to as a persona is the false appearance of the role one plays in life, so a person's surface appearance. Okay. Meaning that in a situation, we may not be expressing who we are as an individual completely. We suppress some of those qualities of who we are in order to be congruent with the situation we're in. And probably the best example I probably provided in this class before is I would be willing to bet you act differently when you're home alone versus out clubbing versus at work versus being in this class. That we adjust in some way and hide something about us while we're in situations where we don't feel like that would benefit us at that time. Okay. So in a modern view, is a person is more than what they portray, okay? And also is known as the study of individual differences. So we're really trying to get at the wholeness of the person, who they are despite the situation or the role that they're playing in, okay? We're going to talk about several different theories, and what I want to emphasize is no one theory explains all aspects of an individual's personality makeup. Where we are in the science of personality, like I mentioned in the science of psychology overall, is that we have a whole bunch of different theories that then in combination give us an idea of why people act the way they do. So we'll talk about, for example, we'll go more into depth. We overviewed these at the beginning of the semester, but we'll talk about psychoanalytic theory, which is Sigmund Freud and his gang, which emphasizes unconscious processes. We'll talk about, it's not listed here, but learning learning and shaping, of the environment through learning theory, such as operant and classical conditioning. We'll look at the humanistic approach, which emphasizes self motivation, the self concept, becoming the best person we can be. It's a motivational theory. Probably the one that people most associate with personality theory is trait theory. And this emphasizes these enduring dispositions or qualities that contribute to a person's ability to relate and communicate and behave. And again, going back to that term enduring is an important part of this. Okay. We'll look at the ideographical approach, which emphasizes experience and one's life story. If you remember when we did the memory section, there was that speaker who talked about memory and memory tasks and the memory palace. And he mentioned at the end that who we are is an accumulation of our experiences, and who we become is an accumulation of our experiences and our memories. This is kind of that ideographic approach. And then social cognition emphasizes things like awareness and beliefs, expectations and goals for where we should be and how we think about them. So it's a combination of these, if you notice the differences between them, where one stops, the other one fills in. Okay. And so let's take a look. I want to start with the beginning of formalized theories of personality. And there's three real main areas that really looked at or gave us formal theories and ideas about how we should interpret the self and and our personality. The first one is William James. If you remember from the beginning of the class, William James, also known as the father of American psychology, he emphasizes the idea of functionalism. Okay, what is the function of the self? What is the function of personality? And we'll review his ideas in what he coined as the self concept. And he also coined a term we use very much today, the term self-esteem. So we'll talk about these two concepts first, and then we'll go into Freud's notion, who gave us really the very first kind of formalized theory of personality with his notions of unconscious desires and drives. And then we will then go into Skinner and Watson's and how they felt personality developed through through operant conditioning and classical conditioning or associative learning. And so these are kind of the first beginnings in the science of psychology to understand individual differences and personality. So William James coined this term. He coined the term self-concept. And what he said is that the self-concept, if we represent the self-concept as a circle, the self-concept is everything that we can say is us. And we put all of those things in this circle, okay? That's the self-concept. Self-esteem is your evaluation, your positive or negative evaluation of that self-concept, okay? But before we get to these two and get into them deeper, let's go back, let's talk about how we evaluate who we are as an individual. William James proposed that we see ourselves in two different ways. We see ourselves as the me and the I. The me is how we think people view us in action. The I is how I view me in action. Okay. So a good difference would be the me I ought to be me more often because people like me. Okay. You hear that term that it's a evaluation from others about who you are as a person. The I is I am a good person without the notion of how others view us. Okay. Now, this becomes more real important to understand these differences because, as we'll see when we get into humanistic theory, there's a difference between the person we think we ought to be based upon those around us and the person we truly are. And these differences have a very big impact on our motivation to change and develop and grow. Okay. So just kind of keep these differences in mind. And when you're thinking about yourself, are you thinking about yourself as you view yourself? Or are you viewing yourself how you think others are viewing you? Okay. Both of these are going to contribute to the self concept. Okay. For William James, he divided our self concept into two. Okay. Excuse me. The first part of who our self concept is our social identity. This is related to this term me. Our social identity is everything we are given to us by our social world, our culture, and our language. Okay. So, for example, whether we view ourselves as man, female, or androgynous or transgender, that's a social self concept. If we're a mother or a father, if we're a good sibling, if we're a child, I shouldn't say good, a child, student, professor, employee, all of those identities that are given to us from our social world. And this includes things like our ethnicity, our race, because none of these things would exist without culture, without someone telling us you're a man or you're a woman, or you are Tana Atham or you're European white, as an example. Okay. So this is the social self. Now, okay, let me go on to this. The second one, originally William James coined this as the spiritual self. I'll do it with an SP. Later on, it became known as one's personal identity. Okay. And according to James, the spiritual self, and I'll kind of emphasize why he called it the spiritual self, is everything that makes you uniquely you. It's almost the definition of personality. It's your emotions, it's your feelings, it's your thoughts, it's if you're social or non-social. It's all of those factors that make you uniquely you compared to the person next to you. And this is why I like relating this term from James. It's kind of that spiritual self. It's who you are transcending social situations. Okay. It's who you are as a being, in essence. Okay. So now in modern research, we do note that sometimes your social and personal identity can become one and the same. So if you strongly identify as female and you feel like being feminine is a very unique quality to you and you embrace it, that's both a social identity and a personal identity because they become part of who you are. And I'm going to use James' term again, spiritually. If you are very connected to your Tana Afam culture, if you're Tana Afam, and that is something that is very personally important to you, then it becomes both a social identity and a personal identity. And that's why it's hard to kind of say, well, this one totally represents personality, because there are aspects of us that are personality features that were originally given to us by our social world, and then we made it uniquely who we are. Okay. So this is who we are and our self-concept and everything else. Now, James also coined the term self-esteem. This is how much we value our self-concept or our identity, whether we have, and I want to focus on a word here, affective. A synonym for this word affective is emotional. Evaluation of whether we're a good or a bad person, whether we're a likable or unlikable person, whether we feel well about who we are. Okay. The reason why this term needs to be focused on is affect and emotions are not logically based, meaning they don't necessarily use the rational areas of our brain, the cognitive areas of our brain to evaluate who we are. And probably the best example is you could have a a very successful, according to American values, person. They could have a good income, a good home. They could have the uh, uh, the spouse, I should say, spouse or partner with 2.5 kids. They can have the RV. They can have all of these things that in American society we value, but they can think very lowly of themselves. They don't like who they are. Okay. Likewise, you can have someone who doesn't meet the American values. Maybe they're homeless and living on the streets, and they may completely appreciate who they are and feel that they're a good person and worthy and all of those things. And so the point being is I have a good friend who studies self-esteem, and he always says self-esteem is associated with everything but predicts nothing, meaning that it is important for us to have value for ourselves. It can mediate things like depressive symptoms and all of those kinds of things. But increasing self-esteem does not always produce a positive outcome. Okay. And I'll give a clinical example. I entered the field of domestic violence and sexual abuse when offender treatments were just barely being developed and barely being implemented from a non-anger management perspective. It was actually programs specific for domestic batterers. And in that time, the theory of domestic violence went something like this. You start off with an individual who has very low self-esteem, and in order to make them feel better about themselves, they abuse someone that then has lower self-esteem than they do, which makes them feel better about who they are. Okay. So the early treatments for batters treatment started with increasing the batter's self-esteem. The unfortunate part about this is it didn't actually decrease domestic violence, it actually increased it. It actually made the domestic abuser more effective at what they were doing. In a lot of cases, they no longer needed the drugs and alcohol to beat their spouse. Because what happened is with self-esteem comes confidence in who I am as a person. And if I hold certain beliefs about a partnership or about a marriage or about an intimate relationship, it solidifies my belief in those ideas and makes me confident that my abusive behavior is the correct conduct. Okay. So my point being in our self-esteem culture that we come to, increasing one's self-esteem does not always have a positive outcome. And I will say that measuring people who have propensities towards domestic violence, they actually don't have a low self-esteem. Many of them have an inflated self-esteem. So that's something to consider. And that's just one example of the line we have with self-esteem and its evaluation of who we are and how sometimes improving it doesn't always have the social effects that we would like it to have. Okay. All right. So then we have learning theory. Learning theory basically says that personality is that individual differences is a response to environmental variables. Okay. And that the mind is nothing more than a reflection of behavior. And in essence, our mind or our self-concept is an illusion. Okay. And that all behavior is a consequence of classical and operant conditioning. Here we have a very environmental theory of personality that we're not born with very much. Um, we're not, we're more of that kind of blank slate. And it's the experiences in the world that we have, those learned experiences that drive us towards our individual personality and who we are, okay, in response to needing to survive within that given environment, okay. Now, an important kind of addition to this, Kurt Lewin was not necessarily a behaviorist. He was actually a social psychologist. But what he wanted to do is balance out this idea that a person brings something to a situation, but the environment also is acting upon it. Okay. So I want you to kind of remember this equation that we have. So B equals behavior. P is going to be the person, the individual, and E is going to be the environment. This equation is what's called a function equation. This F means that B, behavior, is a function of a person interacting with their environment. Okay. So, in other words, whenever we go to a situation, we bring something to the situation. And the environment also brings something to the situation. And it is a combination of those two things that determine our behavior. Okay. So we have to weight these equally according to Kurt Lewin's equation. The other thing, obviously coming from, we're looking at William James and even theories before that about what determines an individual. We want to look at the biological determinants. How much of our behavior is determined by biology, genetics versus environment, okay? And I will say, if you remember from our lectures on philosophy, this debate has been occurring for thousands of years. If we look at medieval, if we look at Greek, if we look at Egyptian ideas, a person is born into the situation and they have the biological propensity for that situation. So this is where we get the notion of bloodlines. Only people with royal blood can become the king or the queen. Only people with merchant blood can be merchants. Only people with labor blood can be laborers. Okay. And so this notion about how much of who we are has been debated for centuries. Where we are today is the most popular technique to study how much is determined by biology is through twin studies. What you do is you take two identical twins that share 100% of their genetic material with each other because they were monozygotic, meaning that they the egg was fertilized and then the egg split into two different embryos. Okay, so they're 100% genetically similar. But these twins then were raised in two different environments. And so any personality similarity would be due to their biological, their genetic similarity. Any differences would be due to their environment. Okay. And you could probably guess that based on the studies that you read, whether they're more environmentally focused or more biologically focused, the range of what's called genetic disposition or genetic quotient is that anywhere between about 20% to 60% of our personality is determined by genetics. Okay. Now, why is there this wide variation? We have almost what, a 40% difference in studies. Okay. And part of it has to do with the problems and benefits of using monozygotic twins or identical twins to study. Because monozygotic twins tend to look the same too. And therefore, because they look the same, their environment treats them the same. Okay. A lot of evidence of this comes from studies done with teachers. Okay. And so we go ask teachers, do you treat all of your students equally? Do you give them all the same attention? Okay. Are you what's called egalitarian with your students? And there's teachers who will say, no, I'm not. I will treat Billy much different than I treat Anne. Okay. There's some that do say outright, no, I do treat my students differently. But there's teachers who say, yes, I'm completely egalitarian. I don't care where my student comes from. I give them the same amount of attention, same amount of time, fair feedback, all of those things. But then we go in and we measure how they respond to different children. Now, I don't like using terms like ugly and those kinds of things, but we can divide children based on ratings of different people on a level of child attractiveness and unattractiveness. Okay. And we found that even the most egalitarian teacher tended to give more attractive or what we would call cuter children more time, more positive feedback. When they did do something wrong, they excused the child's behavior. And so they got more time, more positive feedback, and excuses were made for their behavior. The less cute children tended to get more negative feedback, more punitive things when they did something wrong, and less attention from the teacher. And this did not matter if you were a completely egalitarian teacher or a completely, I treat them all different type of teacher. They all had this propensity to treat children different based on their level of cuteness. Okay. So this is why we have such trouble narrowing down biological underpinnings on personality, because even when two children have the same genetic makeup, but they're raised in a different environment, they're probably being treated very similar based upon their physical appearance. Okay. So that's kind of why we have troubles with monozygotic twin studies and how to interpret them. And we have such wide variation. Okay. Now, there is one personality factor that we have pretty well nailed down. I don't want to say 100%, but at least 98% of it is genetically determined, and that's temperament. Temperament seems to be a emotional personality trait that tends to be almost completely biologically based. So your temperament is going to be either like your mother's or your father's. It's not gender based. It's kind of a flip of the coin. Whichever genetic marker you get is the temperament that you have. So either you have your dad's or you have your mom's. Temperament is emotional responsivity. So someone, if you've heard someone with a hot temper, they react very quickly and very emotionally. If you know someone with a cool temper, they almost seem very unreactive. It's like you wonder whether they're having an emotional experience or not. Okay. And then most of us are somewhere in between those two. Okay. But our emotional reactivity seems to be completely genetically determined by either our mother or our father. Now, but again, that doesn't mean that culture and environment don't impact our temperament. Okay. For example, a person who has a very hot temper can, through learning processes, learn how to control that emotional response. So if you have a really hot temper, you might have some type of activity you do in order to make it so you don't respond very emotionally to something that's being told to you. So while temperament is biologically based, the expression of temperament can be tempered, we want to use that term, or influenced by environmental, cultural, and learning. Okay. We do know that personality tends to be adaptive. We do think that we are soft wired to develop personality, which fits our unique adaptive needs. And we do see that neurological processes develop with this adaptation. So the neurological tracks for a person who is extroverted are slightly different than the ones that are introverted. But we're not necessarily born with those tracks hardwired. It all depends on our interaction between our environment and the person. Okay. All right. Let's see if I can get through Freud quickly. Okay. So we're going to start with a formal theory of personality. One of the reasons we're starting with this one is it's one of the very first formalized theory. It's also an example of a theory which gives a place for personality. There's components to it. And so instead of it looking at its function like William James did, we're going to look at what are thought as the components of the mind, of personality. Okay. And we're going to talk about Sigmund Freud, and then we're going to talk about some of the what are called neo-Freudians that are going to change some of his theory to emphasize different things. I'm not going to completely review Sigmund's history. I kind of mentioned it at the beginning of the semester. He was a neurologist, became a medical doctor, and he largely worked with people with mentally illness, assault victims, criminally minded individuals, people at the time who were called histrionic in ways. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the abnormal psychology section. And if you remember using evolutionary theory, he believed that people, everyone across cultures, are born with two basic instincts, the life and death instinct, which he's going to narrow down to sex and aggression. Okay. And he's going to use this model to kind of explain it. He's going to say the majority of who we are is kind of like an iceberg. The majority of the reason we behave the way we do is below the water, like an iceberg. 90% of the reason we act and behave the way we do are under the level of our conscious awareness. Only about 10% of the reason we behave the way we do are we consciously aware of that is safe to note. Okay. Our two basic drives are going to be housed in the id, as we expressed at the beginning of the semester. We're going to have an ego, and we'll get into these in more detail here in just a minute. The ego has access to the external world and access to the needs and the drives of the id. And its job is to kind of make it so that we respond socially appropriate to the world in order to satisfy our sexual and aggressive urges. Okay. And then we have something that the ego and unconscious developed, which is called our superego. This is also called the moral part of our unconscious. It is, and when we use moral in Freudian terms, we're talking about perfectionists. This is how we ought to act within a civilized world. Okay. And it is kind of the antagonist to the sexual and aggressive drives of the id, kind of trying to balance these two forces that are occurring. So let's take just for a few minutes a deeper look at these different forces. So consciousness is what we experience as reality and awareness. It's our perceptual conscious stimulus from the environment, our processing of environmental information, and our understanding of it. And it's our mental structures that are non-threatening, okay? I would be willing to bet if what's meant by non-threatening is I would say that if your id had its sexual expression, if you went around and had sexual thoughts about everyone and had that urge to act out on them, that would become very concerning to you, I would think. I don't know. Maybe for not some people, maybe subpopulation, they'd be, oh, I'd be okay with that. But for the majority of individuals, that notion that we would have that want and desire is kind of threatening. So it's pushed down and left out of our conscious thought. Okay. The unconscious processes, again, we're talking about the id. This is the primal part of the unconscious, and it's driven by what Freud does stated is the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle is that I do everything that provides pleasure and I ignore everything that might provide pain. Okay. And its goal is to gratify two basic needs. Again, he used the term eros and thanatos. Eros is our life instinct that Freud is going to narrow down to our sexual drive. Thanatos is our death instinct or our destructive instinct or drive. And he's going to narrow that down to aggression. Okay. So these are two things that we seek out pleasure for. Okay. Now, he originally termed the term libido. This originally, if you think about libido today, libido is defined as someone's sexual prowess. So a person with a big libido often has sex on their mind a lot of times. They go out to seek it, and they have someone with a low libido. Sex is less important to them and less interesting. For Freud, libido meant psychic energy. It's what gives us our energy to think and behave and have consciousness. Okay. The id is the illogical component because you think about life and death instinct, they're two opposing forces. So they're primitive, chaotic, inaccessible, unchangeable, amoral, illogical, and unorganized. Okay. I would bring your attention to the Homer here on the left. where you have the devil Homer, which would represent, of course, our two basic instincts. And here in the minute, we're going to introduce the superego, which will represent the little angel Homer right here in just a moment. The appearance of two competing things vying for who we are is a Freudian term, okay? If we look at even religions such as Christianity, before Freud solidified his ideas and it really started to impact popular culture, the notion of good and evil vying for who we are didn't exist. Okay. The notion that Satan is out to grab your soul and you got to listen to the angel on your side. Those kind of stories were more mythology. They weren't taught as something that was factual until Freud kind of introduced these concepts of the mind. Okay. So the ego is the other unconscious process is kind of, if we go back to our Homer example, Homer would be the ego because he's listening to Devil Homer and he's listening to Angel Homer and he's trying to decide on the best course of action. Um, and so if we look at then the ego in this context, it operates on what's known as the reality principle, meaning it's not always good to just be a pleasure seeker. There are certain ways we must act and behave within a given situation. And it is the only unconscious component that has contact with reality because it mediates between reality and the pleasure principle. And if you want to think about the ego, when we talked about the working memory back in the memory section, this is kind of what it, kind of in Freudian terms, what it is that decision-making executive branch of the mind. Okay. And then if we take a closer look at the superego, um, we have it operates on what's called the idealistic principle, meaning perfection. It grows out of the ego. It has no energy, no contact with the outside world. And it's important to note it's not driven by happiness. That's the pleasure principle. It's driven by the idealistic or perfection principle. Okay. It drives forces of the superego on the conscientious level. It's who I should not do, what I should not do. On the ego ideal, it's what we should do. And the purpose, again, is to control the aggressive and sexual impulses of the id to make us, quote unquote, a civilized person, if we put it in Freudian terms. Okay. So this is kind of how it's put together. We have the idealistic drives, we have the pleasure drives, we have the external world, all compressing on the ego, which then has to decide on our behavioral and emotional response. So in simplistic terms, how do these interact to give us our personality or our personality features? Well, if we have a ego and an oversized id and an undersized ego, we tend to be pleasure seekers. Okay. If we have a equal id and oversized superego, we tend to have anxiety, feel guilt-ridden, depression, those types of things. And then if you look at Freudian therapy and psychoanalytics, the goal is to increase your executive branch, your ego, and compromise between your id and your superego. Okay. You'll notice that we don't get rid of the id because the id is part of human nature. Human sexuality is part of human nature. Human aggression is part of human experience. Same with the superego, acting in a way that is congruent with a situation is a human quality. So we have to be able to express these both, but in a way that is congruent with the environment or the situation. Okay. All right. And this also gives us some other terms that have been used in from Freudian times. Some other ones. The term narcissism means extreme self-love for oneself. It's one's ego. Love now means a libido invested in an object or person. Sadism is when we have and masochism is when we have a imbalance between our aggressive and our sexual needs, meaning that we have to either conflict pain or aggression or experience suffering and pain in order to have some type of sexual pleasure. So it's our id kind of gone awry, conflicting with each other. All right. I'm going to end with Freud's theory with this today, with defense mechanisms. Now, I should say Sigmund Freud is often credited for giving us defense mechanisms, but I should state just kind of some historical fact. Freud never actually used the term defense mechanism. It was actually his daughter, Anna Freud, who developed the term defense mechanisms. And defense mechanisms are techniques that in the short term are used to protect our sense of self and our sense of our personality. In a sense, it's a mechanism to protect our self-esteem about who we are, because we're hearing something that is counter to what we feel or think we are as a person. Okay. So these are ways that we use to protect who we are. Now, I will note before we get into these that these are still used today in modern therapy. They've been expanded on and changed a little. They tend to be called thinking errors now, is because it's thought as poor thinking to or irrational type of thinking in order to come to a conclusion of something. But these are often ways that have been validated that we try to protect who we are. So let's rehearse these just for a minute, and then we will finish up for today. So our first and probably most popular mechanism is denial. And that's when we don't acknowledge that there is a problem. So probably one of the most ones that people think about is, for example, the alcoholic who denies that they're an alcoholic, denies that they have a drinking problem, denies that they have those kinds of things. A man that just got diagnosed, for example, with HIV might deny, no, they made a mistake. He's a lousy doctor. No, I don't have a disease. One of the first processes of grief when we lose someone close to us is denial, denying that they're gone. And it's one of the first processes of the grief process. My personal example of this is in 2019, I was diagnosed with congestive heart disease due to cardiomyopathy, which is an enlargement of my left ventricle of my heart. And my form of denial was to do for the first year anything that was good for my heart. I made a lot of really bad decisions because I didn't want to believe that I had this disease, this chronic disease. And so I denied it and I tried to prove the doctors wrong. I pushed myself to show that no, my heart's fine. Okay. That's an example of denial. Okay. Repression. So we'll mark this one off. Repression is suppressing a memory until it disappears into the subconscious. So a woman doesn't recall, for example, being raped. Now, I want to stop here for just a minute because we cannot purposely decide to forget something. It's impossible. Okay. And probably the most simple example of this that we have is what's called the pink elephant paradigm. Okay. So if I had you all close your eyes and imagine a pink elephant, maybe it's a stuffed pink elephant. I did this lecture in cultural psychology on Tuesday, and someone says they imagined Dumbo. Maybe it's a real elephant that you're imagining is pink. Just get a pink elephant in your mind. And then what if I ask, tell me once you forget about that pink elephant? Okay. And when I did this in live classes with in classrooms, someone would raise their hand and say, I forgot. And I'd ask them, well, what did you forget? I forgot that pink elephant. No, you didn't, because you just remembered what you forgot. Okay. So the point being on a more complex level is that we can't actually purposely forget something. Now, there are brain mechanisms and stuff where we have trouble retrieving information, but most of the time when we forget something, it's a retrieval error. It's not that we forgot. Okay. However, this is where I have to always do the however. Our brain does have a mechanism to prevent us from recalling information that is not safe for us in a given situation. Okay, so I'll bring up an example of when I used to work with victims of sexual abuse. Okay, I usually in my calendar mark down to call them and get in touch with them about, especially about 9 months after the traumatic event occurred. Okay. Um, uh, Hopefully, because it's not a chronic issue, they're not going to go home to the same abuser, those kinds of things. But in this type of situation where why did I mark 9 months? It's because around the 9 month mark, I'd give them a call and they'd often say, I feel like I'm going crazy. I smell certain smells and I get anxious and I get sweaty and my heart starts to beat. I keep waking up with night terrors. I have these visions of it happening all over again. Okay. Well, what in in acute situations of this type of violence, what is going on? Around the 9 month mark, they usually have distance between them and the offender. The offender is hopefully going through the court system or has gone away, far away. Um, Usually by now they've resolved their intimate relationship. Just on a sad note, why I'm using the word resolved is because about 75 to 85% of intimate partners leave their sexually abused partner. So I say resolve because they've gotten distance from that intimate relationship. But for that 25% of individuals, they've tend to moved on in their relationship and their relationship is building in back together. Okay. So, and they feel safer. Well, right then, the hippocampus and the amygdala, I'm going to use these as if they have personalities. They get together and say, oh, okay, they're in a safe place now. Let them have their memories back. And boom, they start having these flashbacks and almost like post-traumatic stress symptoms. Okay. This also explains why some individuals that once they leave their home, they start to have flashbacks about child molestation. Okay. Because, and usually this will happen in the 20s and 30s. because what's going on is the brain has kind of, while they're in that home environment, is trying to keep the individual safe. So it's kind of blocking those memories of molestation. And then they get into that safe environment and it says, okay, they can start having these memories of these early childhood experiences. And that's when a lot of, well, I'm not going to say a lot, a good number of individuals start going to a therapist or someone and saying, gosh, I'm having these memories of, okay. Now, I do want to be cautious on that. There are some very unethical um, therapists who actually seed the idea of molestation where it actually never really occurred. But there is a number of individuals who've been molested where they did appropriate interviewing, and sure enough, they were molested. So there's a lot of controversy on this. We won't go through it or rehearse it right now, but just so everyone knows, there is, there can be seeded memories, but there are also individuals who truly have these recovered memories. Okay. All right. Projection is putting your own beliefs and behaviors, so those unsavory beliefs and behaviors, onto someone else. Okay. Probably, if we want to do a stereotypical example of projection, this is where the priest who is molesting young boys and young girls projects molestation and abuse onto sinners, and only sinners can do something that atrocious. So it's kind of putting your own beliefs and values that you don't like about yourself onto someone else. Um, and again, well, no, I won't get into that right now. So that's an example of a projection. Regression is when we act in a way that is not typical of our age. So we tend to do this when we're feeling pressured about responding to something, and the anxiety and stress increases, especially when it has to do with something that is traumatic that you want to move on from, but somebody wants to pressure you into saying stuff, saying things. Our brain tends to, and we talked about this when we talked about biological psychology with the fight or flight response. Our brain tends to stop flowing the blood from the top of the brain, the higher end, and goes down to the limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain. And our brain is going to use our most well-learned adaptive behavior to deal with that situation. And when was our most learned adaptive behaviors learned? They were between the age of 3 to 6. Okay. And so I can give two examples of regression. One is a couple who get in an argument. At the beginning of the argument, both of them may have logical positions of the reasons why something happened. And they may start out talking with each other very calmly. But as the emotions and the stress of digging deeper into why someone did something or didn't do something, eventually we start losing that cognitive, rational reason, and we start to behave like little children. So we start with the name calling, the slapping each other, the all those things that you would expect about a 3 to 6 year old to be doing. Okay. The other example that I always hated, especially when I did advocacy work, when we took survivors of abuse to a court where they had to sit on a witness stands, is defense attorneys know regression very well. I don't know about you guys, but I know a lot of people, including myself, that when I was a little kid and something happened to me that I just didn't understand, I laughed. It was a natural tendency to laugh because I wasn't sure what else to do. Okay. And so a lot of defense attorneys know this. So what they do is they pressure and pressure that witness and get them stressed and stressed and stressed until finally that person gets to a regressive state to where maybe they laugh, oh, because they weren't sure how to respond. And the mechanisms in their brains are down to that limbic system. And that's when the defense attorney goes, ha, see, this witness is laughing. It's a joke to them. This court hearing is a sham. Judge, can we move to dismiss? Okay. So that's another example of regression that we should be aware of. And if you're going to work with in the advocacy field for those who know this, this is why it's important to prepare your survivor for those type of events. All right. Displacement is when we show emotions towards someone or something completely unrelated for which caused it. Okay, so in the example here, it's an alcoholic gets in a car accident, driving drunk, and blames it on his wife, who is at home, who's totally unrelated to it. My example of this is it's not uncommon for people who come into the penitentiary system, the prison system, to sit and you ask them, why are you here? They're not going to say that I was driving drunk. They're going to say, well, this idiot called the cops. A police officer happened to be there. I had a stupid attorney. That judge was unfair. They're going to say everything else is everyone else's fault. But me getting in a car when I had a fifth of whiskey, that's not what caused this. Okay. This is a form of what's called displacement. And it indeed, in a lot of penitentiary systems that do programming to help offenders, one of the first things they work on is getting the offender to accept that they committed a crime and that they need to take responsibility for it, regardless of how fair they think the legal system is or whatnot, but to get them to that point of self-acceptance. Okay, so that's displacement. And then rationalization is making an explanation for something that has happened that is more logically based. And probably the best example is things like victim blaming. And this is where a rapist, for example, thinks that a girl he is raping looked at him seductively one time, so it must be okay. Or if she was wearing scantily clothes, she was asking for it. It's rationalizing that behavior because there's a good reason. Women who dress scantily want sex. That's what they're out there for, as an example. Okay. All right. We're at 112. I did a lot of talking.